Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Wes Kennedy. I'm in product marketing here at LightBeam. Today, I'm excited to announce the general availability of our access governance platform. And in keeping with that theme of access governance, today I'd like to spend some time discussing how proper access governance tools can help us eliminate oversharing and unauthorized data access risks. We've all been discovering and classifying our data for decades, which in and of itself is not an easy task to get right. You've likely got a tool or two or seven that go out and discover all your data across all your platforms, and then they make an attempt to classify it with moderate success, moderate accuracy. Most of those legacy data security tools utilize a regex first approach, which is a rigid and outdated approach, and anybody that's tried to write regex knows how much of a pain it is. I relearn it at least 5 times a year. Um, so when you try to use a regex approach, we find that it's hard to get it right. It's hard to keep up with those ever-changing data types and data sources because we're working with a rigid set of rules. When we find that we're unhappy with how accurate our classification is with those legacy tools, then we start to bring in other tools to layer on top to maybe add some AI classification to hopefully add additional business context to the data that we find. But when the underlying basis of our classification and discovery is based in that regex world, we find that it doesn't really help our accuracy. But let's say that all these efforts work, all of these tools work together well, and you discover all of your sensitive data and you get it classified accurately. Those efforts in and of themselves are not enough to ensure our data security. So what do you do after you have all of your data discovered and classified? So when building out a security program, a lot of businesses follow the Gartner model of designing the data security program. They've got it spelled out. It's a 5-step program. We're not going to go too deep into that today, but basically they use that as a roadway to figure out, what do we need to do to ensure that we have proper data security, privacy, and governance. The basis of all of that is accurate classification and discovery, of course. So when you begin your data classification, data privacy journey, you need to figure out and start doing an overall assessment of what is your data security posture. And if you're a person with an engineering background, such as myself, you'll often just go searching for another tool instead of stopping and looking inward at the business and figuring out what do we actually need for our business and our business data instead of just strapping on another tool. But before we get too much further into this, we need to actually define what data security posture management is, its pillars, and its features. Data security posture is typically broken down into 3 pillars: security, privacy, and governance. Without all 3 of those pillars, your program and coverage will be incomplete. If your program's incomplete, then you're left cleaning up the broken pieces or trying to figure out what data is missing or where that certain piece of data is, or why did this get classified as a social security number when it's just a random 9-digit number. So in order to ensure that your data security posture is rock solid, you need to actually break down each one of these pillars into their parts and figure out what is important inside of them, and do the tools that we have get that done for us. So inside of security, I think about it within the context of these 3 pieces: discovery, classification, and remediation. Now, as we discussed, we've had tools to manage our data security for years, decades even. Their capabilities are generally limited to a single pillar, so we end up using multiple tools to build out our whole data security posture platform. On top of that, most of these tools, because they are legacy and they've been built around kind of like years and years and years of technical debt, they're very difficult to stand up and even more difficult to train and get to classify your data properly. But since discovery and classification are the foundation of a solid data security program, It's imperative that you get those two pieces right before doing anything else. Discovery should be thorough. I mean, we have hundreds of data repositories that most enterprises use today. And every day there's a new one being onboarded, whether that's structured or unstructured data, um, or even semi-structured data, like all these SaaS apps that we're now consuming. You think about like something like Salesforce or Jira, the data can be structured, but the structure changes. So we call that a semi-structured data source. Most of the platforms that we've seen around for the last couple decades are struggling with these SaaS platforms and bringing in those semi-structured data sources. So in order to have a proper discovery mechanism, you need to be thorough, you need to cover all the data types that your business uses, and you need to be able to speak to all of those data storage locations. Now, when I mention data types, I mean documents, PDFs, images, databases, text files, PowerPoints, chat sessions in Teams or Slack. Wherever your data is, wherever you're using that business data, you need to be able to discover it. Of course, once it's discovered, then you need to accurately classify it. So the best way to do that is just like we do as humans, we use context. We don't use regex rules in our head. So when you read a document, you know the context of whatever that data attribute is. Or if I'm in a chat session and somebody asks me for David's MRN number, then I just give them the MRN, and I know that that was an MRN and not a social. So we need to ensure that we're able to identify and use the business context of the data. On top of that, we need to be able to identify the data subject. Whose data is it? Whose data is it? It's very important because when we look at the regulatory landscape that we're all operating in, it's all based around the people, the identities of the people of the data that we're holding. And of course, there's more to it than that. We need to understand what the business context, what the business entities are. So maybe we're not so interested from a business standpoint of who the identity of the people are, but maybe we're more interested in what of our patents are being referenced or various pieces of technology that we've created that we want to make sure stay protected. Business intellectual property can be treated just like those entities. So we make sure that we classify that appropriately. So once we have all of that locked down, then we can start thinking about, all right, how do we remediate some of these things, right? So surely we're going to find that data is located in places that it doesn't need to be. And we're starting to trend into governance a little bit. We'll try to stave this off for a little bit. But we want to make sure that if credit card numbers are being stored in Jira when they should only be stored in Salesforce, then we need to either redact or delete those records. Now, moving on to the second pillar, privacy. Data privacy is generally broken up into these, at least in my head. The regulatory landscape, which is ever changing and covering about 75% of the globe right now. The business use of the data. So how are we using that data? What is the purpose behind having that data and collecting it and storing it? And then third-party data use. And that's really about how are we sharing this data with our partners? And we'll get into that a little bit more. So as I said earlier, we've got about 75% of the globe covered with some level of privacy regulatory laws. If you're a global business, you're probably all too familiar with this. And you're probably trying to figure out, how do I keep all of these parts together? How do I ensure that I'm not leaking somebody's data, or I'm not protecting it in the right ways, or I haven't moved it to the wrong location? Data sovereignty issues, right? But even if you only operate in the United States, we have, I think, 26 states with their own data privacy laws. And surely they're not all the same. So that's another patchwork that we have to deal with and figure out. And I have to treat people's data differently who live in California versus Texas versus Montana versus Ohio. It's not easy. So you have to balance the business use of the data, the collection of it in and of itself, with the regulations. It's a little bit more than most of us signed up for inside of the security world, right? We didn't sign up because we're politicians and understand all of that. So we need tools that help us figure this out. And finally, data sharing with our partners is something that's happening more and more. I mean, anybody that loads a website these days sees a consent page that pops up and notifies you of the 832 places that they're sharing data with. Um, you know, what do we do there? How do we keep track of that? So what I want to do is spend a few more minutes talking about what we do with the data security posture and describe governance. And then we'll move into the details inside of access governance, which is our new tool that we've released today, or a few days ago. So inside of data governance, I typically break it down into these three pieces. So, man, yeah, I chose three, and three. It's just the way my brain works, but data governance breaks down into retention, sovereignty, and access. Now, retention's pretty obvious. We think of it as how long do I need to retain that data to remain compliant, right? But you can't just say, I'm going to maintain it forever. There's a data storage cost. But larger than that, there's a data or a business risk when we keep that data for too long. If you get hit with a data breach and you've held that data for too long, you're now putting at risk more identities or more business data that would have never been at risk if you would have gotten rid of it at the end of whatever your regulatory requirements are. And then we move on to sovereignty. Data sovereignty is pretty important. And it's more than just what country the data is stored in. In some cases, it could be what state. In some cases, it's also data storage locations. And part of this gets into what are our business rules around this, our data sovereignty rules. So do I, even though I'm not required to keep my data in the United States, am I doing that because of our business rules? Or go down to the attribute level and are these social security numbers allowed to be stored in an Amazon S3 bucket or in G Drive or in Slack? When I think about data sovereignty, that's what I begin to think about. And then finally, we've got access governance or data access, which is kind of the main focus of the talk today. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to actually expand this because it's a little bit of a broader topic. But within LightBeam, we think of access governance in a couple ways. The first one is who has access to whose data and what data is it? So let's unpack that. We've already talked about identifying who the data subject is, the who of that data. So this is Wes Kennedy's data living inside of G Drive, Slack, and Jira. That's the who's portion of this. The what data is easy. Using contextual AI, we can discover and classify accurately what attributes of mine have you stored in those repositories. Credit card, phone number, address, identification, email address. But when we talk about governance, we also need to know who has access to Wes Kennedy's credit card, phone number, email address. That's extremely important. And on top of that, access governance covers a number of other things. And I've kind of lumped them all into oversharing, but it breaks down into cross-departmental access, open access, and then the data that you've shared with partners. And I know I mentioned that earlier. We're gonna spend a little more time on that. For cross-departmental access, think of it like this. What if John in marketing has access to bank account details of our customers? I don't think John needs that. So when we think about what are the lines that we draw inside of our business of who should have access to what, something like this is important. Do they have a business use for having access to that data? What is the purpose for them having access to that data? You'll notice that governance often needs to be defined with a purpose, right? We can't just assume that because they're in marketing, they don't have it. Maybe there's a reason, but we need to define what that purpose is. So setting off an alert because of that, that's pretty important. Or Jane in engineering can see payroll information. Maybe Jane used to work in HR. And maybe when she moved into engineering, they didn't change her group-based access. And this is where role-based access control starts to fall apart. But in a world of Google Docs and Office 365, open access becomes an even bigger concern. And this is a story that we've heard way too many times. What happens when a DevOps engineer misconfigures an S3 bucket and exposes customer data? Often we're not even aware of that. Or what if Jerry in the Parks and Rec department shares an internal memo publicly? That internal memo may not have been meant for public consumption. It might have been harmless, but who knows? And this is where identifying what documents have been shared with open access is extremely important. And then finally, when we're sharing data with our partners, we think about how many different parts of the organization might be using a third party to, go through their day-to-day business. So what if sales ops misconfigured SFDC, Salesforce, and they shared all customer details with a partner when all they meant to share was just email addresses and business name? What if they all of a sudden have access to what their sales are and how many invoices are outstanding and all of those things? In a situation like that, for a public company, there's a lot of issues when external entities are suddenly made aware of what your sales process looks like and where you're at. It might be something the SEC gets interested in. And then finally, what if marketing shared non-anonymized data with a partner about their patients? Say it was a hospital and they're doing some sort of mailers and they want to send anonymized data about, what the top issues that they deal with at the hospital are. But instead of anonymizing it, it got sent in its raw form and all of a sudden patient details are leaked. Anybody that's worked with healthcare facilities know that any HIPAA violation or things like that comes with swift penalties, and it's terrifying to go through. So when we think about access governance, we really need to think about, can we identify when these things happen? Do we have the tooling to do this? And the only way to have the tooling to do this is when it's a converged identity-centric data security posture management platform. It needs to include security, privacy, and governance, all in a converged environment that can communicate with each other. Because if we're grabbing various pieces and various platforms to make all this come together, we find that there are gaps because they don't necessarily communicate properly. Now, what you actually came to see, instead of me blather on with some slides, is the actual product. So just give me a moment. I'm going to swap over and we'll make that happen. Oh, and while I'm doing that, I did see a question regarding the Q&A. We will be announcing that at the end. The winners at the end. Right. So let's see. Right. So what you're seeing here, as I get logged back in, is the LightBeam console. It's a pretty simple dashboard. It's meant to be extremely user-friendly. I haven't spent I've honestly, like, as a new hire, I've been here for about 4 months. It was so quick for me to jump in and start to understand and utilize the platform really quickly, which is the intention, right? So when I dive in here, the first thing I noticed is how many data sources that we can support. So since this is a demo environment, and we've all seen demos, we try to showcase some of the key ones, right? Now, we support hundreds of data locations and data types on top of being able to connect to individual REST APIs and build some custom things. Um, but you can see here we cover so many of our regular business use cases, such as SharePoint or Google Drive, HubSpot for marketing, Jira, S3. We've got some auto discovery inside of Amazon to discover certain parts of your Amazon environment and automatically start adding those to the list. Snowflake, Outlook, so we can, scan the emails as they land in the inboxes or the outbox and determine what should happen, and then link out to something like Proofpoint or Mimecast to help you enforce some of your rules. Beyond that, we've got SQL and several others, right? These are all kind of like the top use cases. And if I dive into Google Drive, we will see a breakdown of what types of documents and what types of data attributes that we have in those locations. So even without a ton of configuration, even just pointing at Google Drive, we're very quickly able to identify that we've got, I don't know, 70 identities, 58 financial documents, 6 human resource documents inside of this location. Outside of that, we've identified 102 separate identities, individual identities that are located inside of Google Drive. So security number, instances, credit cards, US driver's license, and more. Now we've got tons of classification types that we can dive into. But if we drill into the attributes specifically, we can see these are the specific attributes that are located inside of Google Drive. Why is this important? If we've determined that Google Drive shouldn't have social security numbers in it, and now we know that there are 412 of them, and here are all the files where they're located. Now we can build policies to go in and redact that or delete that information. But it's also helpful to be able to notice, where are they and why are they there and how are they getting written there? So you can open up one of these and dive into, who's accessible by, whose drive it's in. So Aditya, our CTO, happened to put this in there. So just a nice way to be able to figure out who put that data there, and then we can dive into the why, right? And then we're going to go back and we're going to go into the insights. And this is actually one of my favorite pieces, primarily because it's identity centric. And I think that there's something so special about the idea of being able to pull out and suss out the details of whose data are we actually storing, because it's rare that the data, when we get it written into the environment, is actually saved all in one holistic place. And yeah, we might have a source of truth, but then those various attributes are used throughout your business in different ways. So the idea of being able to very quickly identify whose data it is means that when I get a DSAR for somebody, I can go in and say John Johnson and find exactly where John Johnson's data is, or data are. You can see here that there are 3 locations where we have instant or data attributes tied to John Johnson. Postgres makes sense. SharePoint likely makes sense. And then Outlook, maybe, depending on our business use case, we may or may not be interacting with that user through email. So depending on your business, this is where things start to make sense. But you'll notice when there's a rule violation, they'll pop up here for the entity. So I can dive in quickly and figure out what this detection rule is. And basically, it's about where the entity data is stored. It should not be stored in Outlook, is what this rule means. So when I go back, I can then dive in and see, all right, well, how do we pull together John Johnson? How do we know that this is all John Johnson's data, right? These are all the various pieces of John Johnson that we have spread throughout the system, and we've been able to track them as identifiers and link them together. That's pretty powerful. But then when we start to trend into the access governance side of the house, it's about who can access John's data, right? And should they have access to that data? So right now we can see that Kasim is actually the only person that has access to John Johnson's data. So likely this is a good thing. I can then dive into Kasim and figure out, what types of entities they have access to, the types of attributes they have access to. This is a pretty big list. Social security number, street names, postal, last name. This seems like an awful lot of identity information. And I can filter by high to see that they've got credit card, social security number, driver's license, and ID. So when we talk about Kasim, we need to ensure that is this a user that should have access to all that data? And one of the ways to do that is to dive in and see what groups they're a part of. Should they be a member of, let's say, Orca, which is a project in engineering, and also uh, pay stubs, right? So we need to start figuring out how do these people need to access, um, how do they need to access that data? Do they have a business purpose for that, right? Um, Feel free to by the way, keep throwing your questions out there. As I get towards like the end of the semi-scripted demo, I'll go back through and we'll talk about each one of those questions live. And finally, the other piece, that last pillar that we talked about, that third-party data use pillar. So inside of LightBeam, we automatically track where data is being shared externally, what domains they're being shared with externally, how they're being shared. And let's say that we've shared data with FastComply. We can very quickly see that there were 38 objects with PII, 4 individual entities, individual humans that were sent over there, and 13 different data attributes. Here's the breakdown, and here's where it's being shared from. What's nice about this, and I'm going to pick on my hometown a little bit, is if FastComply gets hit with a data breach, we will instantly know as a business what data we've shared with them and whose it is. Think about that for a second. When there is a data breach, there's always a ransom on the back end. And rather than saying all of our customers could have been shared with FastComply, but we don't necessarily know, so now we have to pay for credit monitoring and all these things for those individuals. Instead, we can say, oh, we know that we shared with FastComply these 4 people's data. And furthermore, we can determine exactly what attributes they were that we shared with them. So what does this mean? Well, FastComply might have a mess to deal with, but we only have to work with 4 of our customers to let them know what happened. That's why something that's identity-centric matters. Finally, I'm going to end with diving into the dashboard for access governance in and of itself, or governance as a whole, really. So inside of governance, we have a number of things that we can look at. But first, I want to point out, we link in with your IDP, and we use that as a kind of a source of truth for who might be accessing data. And then we can also link into something like Salesforce to determine like this is the source of truth for our customers and things like that to help identification of those customers inside of our data sets. So once we know who can be accessing data and the groups that they're in, we're able to very quickly determine all of these details about who has access to whose data and what data it is. So you can see we've got 68 users with high data privilege, 19 groups with high data privilege. We have 6 documents containing 10,000 total objects inside of them with open access. That's a pretty big number. We have 5 documents with excessive access, which you can set the bar for what is excessive. I think by default, it's half of how many registered users that you have inside the system. But then you can go in and tweak that. We found no cross-departmental high sensitivity data access, 1 in a medium sensitivity, and none in low. So we're pretty good on cross-departmental access inside of this data set. But what's great is you can start diving into these users and figure out, okay, does Vikas need to have access to the entities that they have access to? Does Wes Kennedy? Oh, I didn't know I was in here. I apparently have access to one entity. Um, do I need to have access to all of those things, right? So just things to think about as you're thinking about what do we do with the access control and access governance side of the house? How do we manage this? How do we understand who has done what? Because not only do we have issues when we have too broad of access or third parties getting a data breach, but we also have issues if we have an insider threat. So if somebody is under investigation for an insider threat issue, we can very quickly see what they've been doing and accessing inside of that data source. So to kind of bring it all home, the only way to build a holistic data security posture management program is when the entire platform is converged and can see and access and cross-reference that data throughout the system. Now we can automate those alerts and send them out to, somewhere else. I don't know, ServiceNow, for instance, or another ticketing system, or whatever it is. But at the end of the day, the interesting thing that we do is when we've set up these rules and these playbooks, which are basically rules that says, oh, data can't, sensitive data such as social security numbers can't live in S3. When those errors pop up, we can configure whether those notifications go to an admin, the owner of the data store or the data source, or the user that placed them there. So the idea that when my team goes to deploy something like LightBeam, we're going to uncover thousands of issues and then our security team is going to have to work nights and weekends to fix it. Well, that's not true because we're putting the onus on the data owners to ensure that it's being resolved. So with that, I'm going to switch over and take a look at some of the questions that we have in here that haven't been answered yet. We've got a good handful of questions, and I'll do my best to answer them all. If not, we will follow up with you and ensure that you get an answer to them. So first, Cassie, does LightBeam have an automated process for revoking data share permissions once a project or task is completed? That's an interesting question. My question back, and this will be a little bit difficult in this format, would be, my answer would be yes, but. So a lot of this can be automated. We've got an API. There's lots of ways that we can do this, but LightBeam understanding that a project is complete is something that we wouldn't necessarily have access to unless we've configured a way to make that happen. If you've got an interesting use case, let's talk about it. We're an extremely flexible and agile platform. So if you've got the right use case, we'll figure out how to make it happen for you. Let's see. Easton Ian, what methods are available for user access certification and reviews? Might actually ask for some clarification there for what you're looking at or looking for. I'll move on and we'll come back. If you can, add an extra note in there, that'd be great. Mark Johns, how does LightBeam address the risks of data oversharing in cloud environments? So I completely neglected to talk about deployment methods and how we link out to things. So LightBeam deploys on premises, and that can be inside of a physical data center, your physical data center, or it could be deployed inside of your cloud, whether you choose AWS, Azure, GCP, IBM, we don't care. The good news about that is, unlike many of our competitors, we're not a SaaS platform that you have to send your data to and then get back an answer. We're not using your data to train our central AI that we're using on a multi-tenant platform. So as far as addressing the risks of data oversharing in a cloud environment, if we're talking about something like AWS S3, we can link out to that whether or not you deploy us in your own data center or you deploy us in AWS or Azure. We connect using security keys and access into your AWS account. And then we do the same discovery, classification, and mapping that we do there. So it doesn't really matter where your data is located, as long as it's an integration that we have or one that we can help you build, we can make that happen. What analytics capabilities does LightBeam offer to identify abnormal data access behavior or patterns? So a lot of DSPM tools rely on user behavior. And user behavior is interesting. But what we find is that's a reactionary process. And although we do have some features to support that, in some ways, what we want to do is try to ensure that those things are remediated up front if we can. So, yes, if Bob gets disgruntled and starts, sending a bunch of stuff to himself over email, that'll get caught, right? Because it'll be based on a rule or a playbook that has been identified. But if there are normal sharing channels that they go through, that's a whole different process, right? But relying solely on user behavior isn't necessarily an answer because users can modify their behavior. They don't necessarily, evacuate a terabyte of data all at once. They might spread it out over time or whatever. So user behavior analysis is part of it. But for that, we would want to link in with a third party and figure out how to do that appropriately. How does LightBeam handle compliance requirements for different regulations? So we've got a number of things that are built in from a compliance like GDPR and HIPAA that we can help you ensure that you get those day one. But at the end of the day, what we do is we utilize our playbooks to define what are your rules to meet the regulations that you fall under. That doesn't necessarily always mean that they will be identity centric. It doesn't always mean that it's about the humans. It may also be about the business data. So our platform is built around the idea that we don't only have to focus on the regulations of the government entities that we fall under, but we also are able to handle it for the business data too. So to answer your question, how do we handle compliance requirements for different regulations? We have a discussion about what those regulations are, what the key pieces are that you need to adhere to, and then based on that, we have a number of playbooks created for certain policies and rule sets. If I recall, I can't remember where we have those stored, but there are a few that we have already built in that help you do that. If you do have more specific concerns, I'd be happy to follow up via email and get you connected with the right people there. So, Karen, can LightBeam provide real-time alerts or automatic lockdowns if unauthorized data access is detected? Yes. Yeah, as data is being accessed, as it's being used, we follow that. So we use the audit logs inside of the native platform, so whether that's Google Drive or Office 365 or an SMB share, we consume those, and then as that is happening, then we can send out either alerts or remove access, revoke access, depending on the platform. And then we have time for just two more questions. And then we're going to do our draw for the Amazon gift cards. Anybody else that I didn't get an answer out to you, I will absolutely respond via email. And I'll get that out to you tomorrow. So let's see. What security improvements have been made in this release to enhance data protection? In this specific release related to access governance, lots of things have been improved upon, and a lot of that comes down to being able to trace who has access to whose data, right? So before, we knew whose data it was and what data it was, but we didn't necessarily know who was able to access it. And that's a pretty major security improvement by being able to read through the audit logs, link out to your IDP system, search through your groups, and determine who should have access to what data, working with you to determine what those playbooks are and what those rule sets are, and then going through and enforcing all of that. There are a number of other ones, and I'll happily send out a list to any of the attendees who've signed up of what the data is or what the features are that we've released. But that's a major improvement from a data protection standpoint. And then So, final anonymous question. What role does automation play in your governance processes? I think we've touched on this a number of different times, but the fact that all of this is happening in real time. So yes, there's like a data ingestion that happens when you stand up the cluster, but after that, we're real time. We're monitoring what's happening in this environment. Each time a file is accessed, files change, metadata changes. So anytime there's a trigger of an event, we're then reviewing that against the policies that you've set and ensuring that they fit into what your governance rules are and what your regulations are, right? So that automation is extremely important because otherwise there's no point in doing any of this because what are we going to do? Do a quarterly review and go back and look through thousands of entries? That doesn't make much sense. So what we want to do is review this live, send out those alerts to the right team members who would have the actionable ability to resolve the problem, and then address whether or not our policies are, exactly what they need to be. And then we can improve over time. All right. With that, we're going to jump off of